right, friends, welcome to the show. After 30 years, or 33 years of hearing that rooster crow, it still makes me laugh a little bit. I have in front of me, the show is Stand to Reason, by the way, and this is Greg Kokel, your host. I have in front of me a book titled The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, and subtitled Why New Atheism Grew Old. That's a good thing in my view. And secular thinkers are considering Christianity again. The author is one of my favorite guys to interview or be interviewed by, and we've swapped the both sides of the microphone on a number of occasions. And he sounds really smart because of his British accent, but he also is really smart. That helps. His name is Justin Brierley, formerly the host of the very popular Unbelievable podcast. And Justin, what a treat to have you back on board today. And what are you doing these days since the demise of Unbelievable, or whatever happened to it? Tell us about that.
Well, Unbelievable has not gone away. It still exists, but I've moved on to new things. And yeah, it's been so long, Greg. There's a lot to catch you up on, to be honest, since we last spoke.
Right.
But yeah, I guess I was on the show. You know, I started the show and hosted it for over 17 years. So it was a long running show with me at the helm. And obviously, we had some fantastic debates over the years. So many big hitters in the world of Christian apologetics and atheism, and lots of theological debates over the years. Grew a really big audience on both sides of the pond. The US and in the UK and all over the world, really. So an absolute privilege to host so many conversations. The time came where I was just feeling led to move on to start some new things. And so it was a very bittersweet goodbye to a show that I loved hosting for so many years. Yeah. But it was time. I just felt God was calling me to do some new things, start some new projects. The new book was just coming out, and there's been a lot of activity around that. So yeah, it's been a blessing, but it was a new start for me.
Well, there were a couple of times when you were low on high-quality talent, so you even had me come in and do a couple of shows with you, some in the UK and one here. And we, as I recall, we're sitting in the same booth here, and I hosted one show where I interviewed you, and then we switched places, and you recorded one of your shows here. That was a lot of fun.
That's
but I
right.
think that was probably 5 years ago or something like that, so it's been a while since we got together.
Yeah.
And your previous book was something to the effect of why you're still a Christian after listening to all the... I had it written down somewhere. I can't find it. Tell us the title of that book.
Yeah, it was called Unbelievable, named after the show, and the subtitle was Why After 10 Years of Talking with Atheists, I'm Still a Christian. So that was very much my case for faith after, at that point, the 10-year mark of the show, hosting these conversations and kind of putting my worldview together and giving a sense of why it makes sense from my perspective. Now, obviously, it's been more like 17 years since I've been hosting those conversations. So I'm still a Christian is the good news. And really the new book is kind of the look of the land, the way that the culture has shifted, really, even since I wrote that first book.
Sure. And
the way the conversations really on faith have been shifting as well.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious before we get into the book, though. 17 years of back and forth with some incredible talent from both sides. And did you ever have a time when you... Man, I was trying to dodge that sneeze the whole time. I hit the button just at the last minute. Sorry. Oh, my goodness. Sorry. Okay, there we go. I was trying to get the question out so you could be talking when I hit my kill button. Anyway, any times where you obviously you had some of the most incredible, thoughtful atheists on your show, along with many from the other side, where you heard things that shook you, at least for a while, before you straightened things out?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there were plenty of kind of times when I was learning as I went along. So often with the show, I remember, for instance, the first time he encountered Bart Ehrman's work. That shook me up when I read Misquoting Jesus, and he was casting a lot of doubt on the historicity and the reliability of the transmission of the New Testament documents and so on.
Yeah.
But in a way, I learned with the listeners and the viewers as we went along. So when I brought him on with Peter J. Williams, a well-known sort of scholar from Cambridge, yeah, absolutely. He did a great job of kind of putting the other case, and as that proverb says, one side seems to have the right case until someone else comes along and puts the other.
Right.
And that's really what the show's been all about, putting both sides together in that way. It was so yeah. Very often I would be going on that journey myself. There was a big journey of learning and discovery as I hosted so many of these conversations between some really great thinkers on both sides.
Well, that's what brings us, I think, to the subject of your your second book, which I guess you've been working on for a while, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. I'm really glad to see this, and I have to say, excuse me, that I think this book is fantastic. It covers a broad number of areas where I think Christian theism really excels in explaining the world compared to atheism. And it chronicles a range of notable academics and intellectuals who have been kind of making a switch. And it's really well written, too, which makes it nice. I have to say it was kind of frustrating for me. I got an ARC, so it's an advanced review copy. And, my schedule's been pretty busy here the last few weeks. And so I'm going through it here trying to get the highlights. And I'm thinking, all right, I want to sit down and just go first page to the last page and not stop, but I'm going to have to do that later. But I certainly got enough out of it to see the quality and prepare for our interview here. So, by the way, when is the book being released? Or has it already been released?
Well, it's already been released. So it actually released in September.
Okay.
And yeah, I've had some wonderful responses to it. So I'm so glad to hear you've been enjoying it too, Greg.
Yeah. Okay, good. Tyndale House is the publisher, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. Okay, so tell us. I think we can start. We already talked a little bit about unbelievable, but I'd like you to talk more about it as the whole strategy format of unbelievable, because that really figures in so much to the insights that you've gained over the years. And a lot of people that you cite in your book are people who are on your program, and it looks like citations of them personally comes from probably the dialogue you had on your program. So those kind of the trend now that you see brilliant secularists that are abandoning their atheism or maybe their agnosticism and even somewhat unwillingly kind of being dragged towards God and towards Christ. So tell us just a little bit about that format of unbelievable and how that figures into your basic thesis here in the book.
Well, Unbelievable, for anyone who's ever listened to it, it has always been a conversational kind of dialogue type show. And to that extent, it's very good as a way of kind of digging into some of those big issues between Christians and atheists and people of other worldviews. I think I prefer that slightly more conversational edge to it rather than it being a debate, because you sometimes get to where people are a little bit more rather than them just sort of, debating and sort of having to stand on a particular worldview.
Yeah, I agree with you, by the way, on that point. Because in debates, then you have people taking sides and it's contrary and whatever. It's the way you handle the conversations in those podcasts were just magnificent. So I agree with you on that point.
That's really kind of you, Greg. I mean, what I noticed, though, as I was hosting these conversations was the show really got going kind of as the new atheism was building ahead of steam. So the new atheism was this very dogmatic, anti-God atheist movement in the culture. And in many ways, that sort of meant that a lot of the shows that we had in those early years of Unbelievable reflected that quite dogmatic, bombastic style of the new atheist versus these well-known Christian thinkers I was bringing on. And that was fun and good, and that was needed at the time, because those were the big questions being raised in our culture. Does God exist? Arguments and evidence for God, these big questions of whether religion is bad for us and that sort of thing. I did notice, though, especially in the latter years that I was hosting the show, that actually the conversations were changing in tone. I was getting fewer and fewer sort of new atheists coming on, and more people who were not necessarily religious but distinguished themselves from the new atheists. They said, well, I'm not really a Richard Dawkins type of atheist.
Right.
And I just noticed that it was kind of starting to go out of vogue. Meanwhile, I'd seen sort of from the sidelines a lot of issues within the new atheist movement itself. There was a lot of infighting, a lot of controversies. To some extent, the movement itself began to splinter and fracture in various ways. And so I was aware that the movement itself was sort of having internal issues, that it was kind of losing some of its public clout. Its influence seemed to be waning. I think ultimately you could even say that some people started to see it as quasi-religious in itself. You know, often the four horsemen, the so-called four horsemen of the new atheism, were almost like the high priests of a quasi-religion, because they had a creed, if you like. You know, scientific materialism was, if you like, their orthodoxy. And if any of their contemporaries, their peers, dared to question it, people like Thomas Nagel and others, they were rounded on, you know, as heretics, really. So it was interesting to see the way it took on this, you know, quasi-religious nature. And I think that in itself, the dogmatism, the fundamentalism almost of the new atheism, actually turned a certain number of people away from it in the end. And in the end, I think it failed to really answer a lot of the fundamental questions. So so the conversation started to change, where I was starting to feature less of these sort of very dogmatic new atheists in the skeptic's chair, but often more people who were actually somewhat open to the claims of Christianity, or at least valued, had a sense of the value that Christianity had brought to the West, even if they weren't necessarily Christians themselves. And I just started to see the audience start to change as well in that way, that not so many people were turning up for these big new atheist characters. They were starting to turn up for some of the people I mentioned in the book. So it was an interesting sort of evolution, if you like, of the conversations over time, away from that more new atheist rhetoric to something fresh.
I think that a lot of people were seeing, and you do mention this in the book, and even people that are atheists, like Michael Roos, for example, who were just got really fed up with the shallowness of the approach of the new atheist, not just the bombast, but what turned out to be lots of straw men, misrepresentations of Christianity, and I think Michael Roos, who's an atheistic evolutionary philosopher from Florida. I get it mixed up. Florida State, I think, not University of Florida. But anyway, he just said, you know, can you guys at least try to understand the other side's view? I mean, it's kind of embarrassing for us. And I think what ended up happening, and again, you talk about this in some degree in your book. I'm going to ask about a particular section that you cited or you highlighted because of the interesting subtitle or section heading. It's just like they were saying, wait a minute, these guys are not only kind of not so nice, but they seem kind of silly in some of the things they're saying when you actually sit down and try to think them through. And so that section that you have, and here you've got a fourfold kind of treatment of this progression here. And the first section deals with the decline of new atheism and atheistic secularism here. And you have a section called "Thank God for Richard Dawkins." And tell us a little bit about what that's referring to.
Yeah, well, I think you're absolutely right, Greg, that a lot of people did come to see that the new atheists didn't have an awful lot in terms of actual arguments. They were strong on rhetoric. There was a lot of sloganeering. There were a lot of memes, you know, that were flooding the internet, but there wasn't actually really anything much in the way of really strong arguments against God. In fact, when some of their best-known characters did go up against some, you know, proper Christian thinkers like William Lane Craig, they usually didn't fare very well. And what I talk about in the book is the fact that actually more frequently, sometimes sadly, they ran away from those kinds of debates. Richard Dawkins rather famously sort of refused to debate William Lane Craig at a serious level. But
they did
the
have
reason
an
I thank God
encounter
for
once.
Richard Dawkins.
I'm sorry, they did have an encounter.
Yes,
they
that's
went
right.
face to face once in South America or somewhere, I think, and then I don't think Professor Dawkins was even willing to shake Bill's hand, you know, something like that.
Yeah, that was probably the one occasion they did sort of meet, though it was a bit of an odd format. It was a sort of 3 versus 3 format, so it wasn't really.
Oh, they did have a discussion
Dawkins engaging properly with.
Okay.
So it didn't really involve a proper sort of, you know, discussion between Dawkins
interaction,
and Craig.
right.
I mean, I was involved at a later stage with trying to get Dawkins and Craig together in Oxford for a debate, and this was in 2011, so we're going back a while. But at the time, I was helping to organise a tour that Bill Craig was doing here in the UK, and he was doing some lectures, some debates, and we wanted the showpiece to be a debate in Oxford with Richard Dawkins, and we issued an invitation and so on. But of course, as we kind of expected, Dawkins refused and gave all kinds of excuses for not doing it. In the end, we were rather cheeky, because you may remember there was this atheist bus campaign in the UK, where buses were going around London with the slogan, "There's probably no God, now stop worrying and enjoy your life." So we sort of had our own cheeky Oxford bus campaign, which said, "There's probably no Dawkins, but come along to the Sheldonian Theatre in Oxford and find out." So it was a fun and rather silly thing, but it for me, it was an evidence that actually, as I say, the new atheism was hot on rhetoric and not so much on argument. But why do I thank God for Richard Dawkins? I think it's because actually we can credit Richard Dawkins and the new atheism for making the church kind of really pick up its theology and apologetics books again. I think to a large extent, throughout the course of the latter part of the 20th century, the church had become quite steeped in emotionalism and kind of more sentimental forms of religiosity, and appealing to people's, that sort of psychological and emotional part of people, and had to some extent forgotten its rich intellectual tradition of Christian apologetics and reason. And I think the new atheist, frankly, helped a lot of Christians to rediscover that by asking some of those tough questions. It forced them to go back to the treasures of C.S. Lewis and other great theologians. And so I was happy to see the way in which so many apologetics ministries, I think, actually flourished because of new atheism. I mean, I don't think My Unbelievable show would have had the impact it had was there not something like the new atheism for it to be responding to. Likewise, you saw your ministry, Bill Craig, many other apologetics ministries that really, I think, grew because they had something meaty to respond to. So to that extent, I do thank God for Richard Dawkins. And I even have friends today who are Christians, ironically, because they ran into the new atheism. It was the new atheism that actually opened up the God question for them. And while it might have initially caused them to think, oh, well, God can't exist, look at these clever people like Dawkins, I think actually those who did eventually get round to looking at the other side of it realized, there's more to this than I'd thought. And so there's another great book out actually at the moment called Coming to Faith Through Dawkins, which is just 10 people's stories of how it was actually the new atheism and Dawkins that led them to faith. So I think we can thank God for Richard Dawkins in that sense.
Amy just told me this morning she ordered a book from someone who had actually contacted us about another title, but I'm looking at Amy now. It's this one that you just mentioned? Oh, it's the one you just mentioned, Justin.
Yeah,
and,
it's a great book.
And that it was Dawkins was the factor, one of the decisive factors in them coming to Christ. So that's kind of interesting. But there's a whole bunch of people. And some that I was aware of and some that I wasn't as I read your book, but like Peter Boghossian, the atheist late of Portland State University, who just finally got so fed up with all the leftist nonsense that he just resigned, and then oddly made a common cause with another Christian, a guy who leads Oratio Christi, who's I'm embarrassed. I'm trying to download his name real quickly here, but they were going around doing debates together on the same side, defending not their own worldviews per se, but against the leftist view that has been so corrupting. And that's something that you talk about in your book, this kind of radical leftism that almost became, for some of these vocal atheists in this country, a bigger enemy for them than Christians. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, this was one of the sort of big things that I was noticing once the new atheism began to wane. One of the reasons it began to wane, frankly, was because there were a lot of fallouts within the movement over the direction that atheism should go. So there was a certain faction that wanted to take it in the direction of so-called atheism plus. So that meant atheism, but also a commitment to things like LGBT, diversity, feminism, and so on. And there was a big kind of move against that at the same time, and from people like Boghossian and even Dawkins and others, where they felt this was sort of politically correct ideologies kind of taking over their movement. So the New Atheism itself kind of got railroaded by the culture wars. They kind of came early in a way for New Atheism. As a lot of these controversies started to kind of split the movement itself. There was, in fact, and if you go to, say, 2021, Dawkins himself getting stripped of his Humanist of the Year award by the American Humanist Association is a very good example of the way in which the atheist secular movement really split down the center. Because why did he get stripped of that award that had been issued several years earlier? Because of his views on transgender. So these kinds of issues began to really polarize the atheist movement itself. And so you've got this interesting dynamic now where Boghossian, for instance, who had come on my show actually in 2014 to do a kind of classic God debate with Tim McGrew, and and at that point in 2014, Boghossian was, you could say, card-carrying New Atheist, because he had written this book called A Manual for Creating Atheists. Right. It was exactly what it says on the cover, an attempt to persuade people out of their religious delusions, and he literally thought of, Christian faith as something like a mental delusion. So then fast forward just 4 or 5 years later, and I approached Boghossian to come on the show again, this time for a live show that we were setting up in Portland, where he was still at the time a professor of philosophy. And his email almost knocked me for six, because he said, Justin, I'm a very different person to the one you interviewed 4 or 5 years ago. He said, the reality is I'm not here to debate Christians any longer. In fact, I think I've got more common cause with many Christians than I have with a lot of my secular peers these days. And at the time, he hadn't kind of gone full blown on his views on woke ideology and so on. But he said, you'll find out what the far more pernicious ideology I'm kind of against soon. And what it turned out was that he and some of his peers were involved in a kind of hoax, creating academic papers, bogus academic papers they were submitting to peer-reviewed journals, which, as long as it had the right politically correct sounding terminology and in the whole area of so-called grievance studies, were getting published, even though these were clearly kind of parody sort of articles. So anyway, that all got rumbled, it came out, caused a big controversy, and ever since, really, Boghossian has always said, I'm far more concerned now about the quasi-religions of the woke left than I am about institutional religion. And it's just so interesting the way that has completely changed the conversation between a number of atheists and the Christians that they used to go to battle with.
So this raises another question. In your book, you say Peter Boghossian is not no longer, or I should say the quote is, the firebrand atheist is gone. Now, I suspect that it's the firebrand part that has been altered, not the atheist part so much, that there is a more pernicious ideology out that he's willing to fight and make common cause with Christians. Do you have any sense that he's begun to question his own basic worldview?
Well, I've listened to 1 or 2 interviews he's done recently. Now, I think he's still an atheist, but I think what's changed is he's realized that New Atheism, by trying to stamp religion out of people, was really barking up the wrong tree. I think he's kind of come to accept that that people are deeply religious in a sense, and if they don't get religious about Christianity, if you just take that story away from them, they'll replace it with something else. And what he's realized is that New Atheism kind of swept the floor clean for all these other ideologies to come in the place of Christianity. And he actually deeply regrets that. I think he feels like we were better off with the kind of the Christian story than all these other stories, which are now, frankly, far more of a danger to Boghossian because they're right in his front yard, in the academy and everywhere else. So I think, although I wouldn't say Boghossian he's not had a Damascus Road conversion to Christianity, I think he's got a lot more respect for Christianity because he's realized it sort of was a bulwark almost against a lot of other ideologies. And he's realized that atheism per se, science per se, rationalism per se, doesn't actually do the job of giving people a story to live into. They need some kind of a story. And I think he's kind of realized that the New Atheism just didn't have a story that could replace the God story. So people started replacing it with all kinds of other stories. So that's my take on Boghossian.
That's because atheism doesn't have a story except for in the beginning of the particles, and that's kind of where it begins and it ends. I have a note here, and I'm not sure I understand my own note, but I think it relates to what you just said. Now, this is Sam Harris, who was one of the four horsemen of the atheist apocalypse, so to speak. And this is a reference to the pragmatic, my note says, a pragmatic loss of Christianity's cultural dominance. And that was, I'm not sure if Sam Harris is really complaining about that, but that's what I wrote down. I don't know if you had more to add, but that certainly seems to be Boghossian's complaint, that there was a cultural dominance that actually was something good for the culture that that is now being replaced. The vacuum of Christianity is being replaced by something more pernicious, as you mentioned, and that is the leftist ideology. It's much more aggressive, much more evangelistic, much more totalitarian than any form of Christian religion in the West has been for maybe 1,000 years, for goodness sake.
Yeah. I would say it's not just Boghossian and Harris who are beginning to recognize this. I mean, I think of someone I've interviewed a couple of times on the Unbelievable show, Douglas Murray. Now, he may not be as familiar a name to you, but he's a well-known sort of political commentator here in the UK. He's and to some extent he became sort of good friends with the New Atheists, at the time that was really in the ascendancy. He'd kind of lost whatever faith he had in his early 20s, and he kind of counted himself among their ranks. But I think he very quickly came to realize that actually atheism per se couldn't give you the sort of the rights and values that we kind of take for granted in the West. He came to realize just how dependent his values and ideals were on the Christian story, actually. And by the time I had a conversation, between him and N.T. Wright a few years ago, he was calling himself a Christian atheist, basically. And he was recognizing that even though he didn't believe the Christian story, he still kind of lived very much as though it were true because of the values. And those values he believed in of equality, dignity, human rights, freedom, they didn't come from atheism, and they were quite fragile. They could go away. And he has been very, very concerned by the leftward sort of progressive turn in culture to all these new ideologies, which he thinks are far worse for us than Christianity ever was. And to the extent that he's one of the people where I honestly see someone who would really like it to be true, is kind of looking almost for a reason to believe. Even he hasn't got there yet, but one wonders whether he might just cross the line at some point, because he can almost see that he wishes that something like the Christian story were true, because he knows that the atheist story can't do the job effectively.
Well, it reminds me of, in a certain sense, the inverse of Nagel, because Nagel says, I don't want it to be true. I don't want there to be a God, but he is forced to acknowledging features of reality that don't fit in with the materialist view. His book was now I'm trying to download
Mind and Cosmos.
Thank you. Mind and Cosmos. Only 4 words, but I couldn't get them. You got them faster than I did because you're in your 40s. Good for you. Mind and Cosmos. And he does make that quote. Of course, you cite him in your book and you talk about him a bit. This other, Murray's observation seems to me to match well with the late Francis Schaeffer's observation that, and I've really traded on so much, Justin, in my thinking about the world, in my conversations with others, that the fact is that human beings have to live in the world that God actually made. And they are actually made in the image of God. And so even when their ideologies reflect a rejection of Christian theism, their common sense intuitions about the nature of the world are consistent with Christian theism and are satisfying. And it's like they want it's interesting. For example, people talk about Mother Nature. Well, they know how they personify what they see, because it appears like somebody's messing with things, but they don't want to bow the knee to Father. They want to just give homage to Mother because she's not making any demands on them. So there's that curious thing that's going on now. And I also wonder, and maybe you have something to say about this, why the delay? These people are really smart. they've been thinking about these things for their whole lives. They have degrees in these things, and they are, some of them, like you've mentioned here, are just beginning to see that the things that they value have no grounding in their worldview, but they have a grounding in the Christian worldview. I was just talking this weekend about the problem of evil, and how the problem of evil makes sense in Christianity. At least it makes sense in our worldview. It belongs in our worldview. It's part of our story, and our story's not over yet. The atheists can't even make sense of the problem of objective evil, which is people have complained about. I just have always wondered, why don't they see that? Why don't they see that all of the things they're advancing and they're expressing as values in conversation, and the great paragraph from God Delusion, how Dawkins is railing against the God of the Bible. It's a very well written paragraph. You could put it to music. I think it's great, but it's not at home in a world in which there's no good, no evil, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference, which is another one of Dawkins's citations. So, do you have any sense of why did it take some of these people so long to figure this out?
I think there's a number of reasons. I think sometimes people don't want to see what is often right in front of them, because it does make a claim on your life. There's an implication. It's not just assenting intellectually to something. If you say God exists, and especially if you say Jesus Christ, was God in the flesh, there's going to be all kinds of implications for that. So I can understand why some people want to kind of hold that off at arm's length as long as possible. I mean, the other aspect of it, though, is I think often the fact that so many people in the West take the idea of human rights, for example, absolutely for granted. They have just been brought up assuming this is completely natural. This is just the way any civilized society functions and thinks. As one of my friends who's written a book on this subject, Glenn Scrivener, calls it, he calls his book The Air We Breathe. It is like the air we breathe. We don't notice it because we're so steeped in it. The way that another friend of mine, Tom Holland, puts it, who's a secular historian, but wrote this fantastic book called Dominion, which really looked at the way the Christian revolution has completely shaped the moral instincts of the West. He says we're like goldfish in a bowl. We don't even think about the water we're swimming in, but the waters we're swimming in are in fact Christian waters. And I think the reason why just now, just at this moment, some of these intellectuals are starting to wake up to the fact that actually it's Christian waters we've been swimming in this whole time is because suddenly the foundations of their own moral structure are being challenged. I think they're starting to realize, it turns out that not everyone has the same idea as me about the nature of reality, about physical biology, about, why some things are right and why some things are wrong. And I think that has led some of them to start to realize this kind of Western, the Western values that we hold so dear are not necessarily just the product of common sense and, reason and science. And so I'll give you the example here of Tom Holland, the historian I mentioned, who's a very popular podcaster here in the UK, has written this best-selling book, but I've had him on the show several times now for conversations. And he essentially grew up with a very secular mindset, went to university, studied history at Oxford University, went on to start writing very popular historical works on the Greeks and the Romans. But what he said to me was, he said, the more that I got into the mindset of the Greeks and the Romans, I realized how very alien their world was to my own. This was a world where slavery was just an absolutely accepted part of the economy, where some people could be the sexual property of others, where the lives of women and children were cheap, where, a Roman emperor would parade through the streets of Rome, boasting of killing and enslaving 1 million Gauls. He said, this world was so alien to me. I suddenly realized, well, why do I believe in freedom, equality, dignity? And he realized it's not because of the Greeks and the Romans. It's not because of science and reason. It's because of this man, Jesus of Nazareth. The movement he began is what gave me my moral instincts today. And he ended up saying, I realized that in almost every way, I am in fact a Christian, Justin. Yeah. And so when someone like Tom Holland goes on that intellectual journey, suddenly I think it starts to niggle away. And he himself has now openly kind of critiquing his secular peers and saying, look, just face up to it. Your belief in human rights is a theological belief. It doesn't come from science or reason or, ancient Greece. It comes from Christian assumptions about us being made in the image of God. And so it's so interesting to hear them say that. Now, in Tom Holland's case, I think he has been edging towards Christian faith. He's that's very much hit him at a personal level. I think others are still sort of somehow managing to hold it out as a sort of an abstract thing, that it's a kind of almost a useful fiction, if you like, that's helpful, but I don't have to accept that it actually has any supernatural implications. So I think it does depend on the individual as to what they're willing to accept in the end when it comes to these ideas.
I have a lot of thoughts here as you're talking, Justin, and even the concept of useful fiction. Well, in these kinds of things, they're not useful if they're fictions. They're just they are just fictions. That maybe you subjectively happen to like. I don't know, because if we have a deep belief in human rights and our deep belief entails that these aren't really real, we're just playing at a game, this undermines the force of human rights, of course. And this gets to a point, and you made this, I want to draw attention to it because I talk about it a lot, and I want people to see the distinction. The way you put it is that they're realizing that these kinds of things do not come from reason. And that's the source. Reason may be a way we know these things, just like a stop sign is the way we know that we ought to stop. But that's not what gives the stop sign its authority. It's a governing authority that the stop sign comes from. And this is the distinction that's really important. People say, well, where do you get morality? And they say, oh, it's just common sense. Well, wait a minute, that wasn't the question. The question isn't how do you know it? The question is, where did it come from? And that's the key thing that gives morality its force. But I don't know if you've been following Bill Maher lately, because he factors into this discussion. Bill Maher, the kind of the comedian, he's a liberal, not a leftist. He's been doing screeds recently, very upset with the left, and very funny the way he does it. And he's pretty much untouchable. A lot of people don't like him. I heard the first one in June during the gay pride thing all over the country, and he said, anyway, the one I listened to yesterday, he was talking about Western civilization and all the woke crowd that's talking about how oppressive Western civilization has been. And then he said, listen, everything that you value came from Western civilization. Now, just a point of information, he doesn't identify Christianity as the source. He identifies Western civilization, but of course, Western civilization sits upon the foundation of Christian values, just as you're pointing out here. And he couldn't go that far, but nevertheless, he is among this group. And I wonder if he's going to come to a point where he's going to be thinking, as these others have, a little bit more about the actual substantive foundations of these liberal values that come out of Western civilization.
I think he is, and this is the fascinating thing, Greg, is that I'm seeing more and more of these thinkers, some of whom were once very ardent atheists, starting to realize that they really that you need something like the Judeo-Christian principles from the Christian story to continue the kind of civilization that we think is worth preserving. Now, it's interesting, as you say, I've watched Bill Maher's sort of journey there, and he's very much gone on that same kind of Boghossian-style journey of kind of realizing that simply railing against religion, as he did, in his sort of new atheist phase, he had that documentary Religulous where he was taking the mickey out of religion and so on. But I think he's again one of these people who've realized there's something far more pernicious that I should be turning my attention to. What's interesting is I'm also coming across characters who are going further than Bill Maher and Peter Boghossian, who are coming to sort of almost embrace theism / Christianity in the process. So just this past week here in the UK, there was a big conference, the ARC conference. It stands for the Alliance of Responsible Citizens, and it's the brainchild of Jordan Peterson, who's someone I feature in the book quite a bit.
He was my next question,
and he's one of these sort of, well, we'll come to him, but he and many others of his ilk, both Christians and non-Christians, were put on this conference, which was basically about asking how do we respond to the progressive left and the capture of culture in that way. And one of the most fascinating, panelists that I watched on that was Aynhurst Ali. Aynhurst Ali is an ex-Muslim Somali woman who became very notable in the sort of mid-2000s for rejecting Islam, speaking out very strongly against Islam. And she very much became sort of one of the new atheist crowd. She was frequently invoked and speaking at their events and that kind of thing. And she kind of became quite an ardent atheist. She has changed her tune remarkably, because when she spoke on this panel, she talked about the fact she no longer considers herself an atheist. And she says what she's realized is that you need something like the Judeo-Christian story and the values that it is that we've inherited. That's the only kind of bulwark that really works against Islam, she's saying. And so it's fascinating when you see someone like that who's actually now kind of decided to shun the atheist label and seems to be edging towards even a kind of a Christian identity, because I've seen that happening more and more with some of these figures who I never imagined would go in that direction, but who interestingly seem to be realizing there's much more value than I ever realized in what Christianity's done for us, and people frankly just giving it a second look because of that.
You know, it's so interesting. I wasn't aware of this regarding her. I knew she was quite a public figure, obviously, in the period that you mentioned. But notice what she's saying. She's saying it's not just theism, because she came from a theistic religion, Islam. It's not, theism is not adequate to ground everything. In principle, it's the kind of thing that's necessary, but not any old theism is going to do it, because we've seen the civil rights, human rights excesses, violations that seem to be inherent to fundamental Islam. When I say fundamental, I don't mean in a pejorative sense. I mean, this is, they follow the leader, they read the book. They take the doctrine seriously as delivered historically. They're not liberals, so to speak, in their religious convictions about Islam. But clearly, theism is not adequate. You need a particular kind of theism that is that is adequate to ground the kind of liberal values, and here I mean liberal also in the best sense of the term, that have been the hallmark of liberty and freedom in the West. So you mentioned Jordan Peterson, and actually you talk about him quite a bit in the book throughout, and he's a hard personality to dodge in this kind of discussion, because I take him as almost archetypal of the kind of dynamic that you describe in your book. By the way, I'm talking with Justin Brierley, author of The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, subtitled Why New Atheism Grew Old and Secular Thinkers are Considering Christianity Again. And there's probably no one, if people who are watching in general know anyone who's in the process, they know about Jordan Peterson, the psychologist from the University of Toronto that became well known because he refused to go along with gender ideology, and that kind of launched him. And then he wrote a book on 12 principles. I can't remember the title, but it was a really big book. I ordered it. That was too big for me to read. I wanted the Cliff Notes version of it. I wanted to get his principles and move on. But in any event, lots and lots of people read it, and it reflects kind of common sense principles for common sense. Let me back up. Common sense principles for being an adult. In a juvenile society or a culture. So tell us, you've had a number of conversations with him. I know on your program, Unbelievable, and I don't know, maybe in private as well, and certainly you've watched him move, like in the ARC convention. Tell us a little bit about that whole dynamic with Peterson, insofar as it reflects this dynamic you're discussing in your book.
Yeah. Well, Peterson is the probably the preeminent example of these secular thinkers considering Christianity again, because he really stole a march on the new atheists to some extent. When he rose to prominence in 2017, 2018, it was on the back of him kind of literally packing out theaters, doing sort of 3-hour lectures on the book of Genesis. Now, many church pastors would wish that they could pack out theaters with sermons on the book of Genesis. But he was a secular psychologist, kind of pointing lots of these people turning up, young men, by the way, pointing people back towards Scripture as a source of meaning, tradition, and virtue. And what I think Peterson has identified was that the new atheism was far too shallow in terms of the kind of answers it was giving to people searching for meaning and purpose and identity. And what he identified was that there is a story, the Christian story, that has done that for generations upon generations, and that we shouldn't just throw it out, assuming that it doesn't have anything to say to us. And he's also identified that there is a meaning crisis in our culture. In fact, a lot of psychologists are talking about this, people like Jonathan Haidt and John Vervaeke and others, that essentially because people have kind of become unmoored from a story that makes sense of their life, because the secular material story, as you said earlier, it's a non-story. It doesn't actually tell you what you're worth, what you're here for, anything like that.
That's right.
And because people are now trying to invent stories for themselves from scratch, whether it be through sexual or gender identities that become kind of quasi-religious sort of sacred status for people, or even political mythologies on the right, there's a sense in which people are looking for stories to make sense of their life, but they're left unmoored, and it's what's producing this meaning crisis, which is resulting in a sort of a pandemic of anxiety, depression, the mental health crisis, and everything else. And so Jordan Peterson, as you say, was not doing anything that sort of radical. He was really sort of just giving good advice, common sense type of instructions about cleaning your room and being more responsible, telling the truth.
Making your bed.
And yet this kind of struck the ears of his young listeners as kind of revolutionary, and he was being bombarded by people who were saying, "You've changed my life," But what was interesting to me was that he was sending people back to the stories of Scripture, and now Peterson's interesting because he takes a very psychological approach to those stories. He's basically a Jungian in terms of his psychological beliefs. And his prime interpreter of Scripture, if you like, is Jung rather than the Holy Spirit. So he tends to take these stories and invest them with a lot of symbolism and psychology. And at one level, there's nothing that wrong with that, because I think Scripture does have enormous psychological depth and wisdom. And I think if you like, Peterson is kind of pointing people towards that. What I'm not so sure about is whether he really takes Scripture on its own terms as also being historically reliable, and there really being a God who is, has a claim on your life. He often talks about God being the highest thing in your hierarchy of values. That's the sort of the Jungian sort of psychology coming out. But I want to say, yes, that could be true, but what if there's also a God who, created you and came in the person of Jesus Christ and everything else? And I think, again, Peterson is kind of on that journey somewhere. I think he is starting to grapple certainly with the person of Jesus. And he recognizes that you need something like God to be able to live a fulfilled, meaningful life. And he's passing on that wisdom to many people, so that even if he's kind of a bit hard to nail down where he is on the spectrum, I know lots of people for whom he's opened the door to Orthodox Christianity, actually. People who've walked through that door. People who were very surprised to find themselves walking through that door because they had assumed maybe only 10 or 15 years ago that Dawkins and his crowd had all the answers. So I just find this a fascinating kind of evolution of what's happening at a cultural level as people are just being primed to potentially hear that Christian story afresh again.
Well, this whole point you're making about the crisis of meaning, which you talk quite a bit about in the book, is meaning is teleological. In other words, that it's not, the problem here is that people have been making up their own meaning in the absence of some kind of transcendent meaning. But meaning, purpose, is teleological. In other words, it's going somewhere, it's pointing to some end, and that end, you can't, if you just manufacture your Jungian God as part of your system, that's not going to give you the kind of meaning that is necessary to ground human existence. It's just going to give you another subjective story, like the transgender crowd is using to replace the story in their new religion. So I'm very interested to watch how this plays out for Peterson, because in your book you mentioned that he refuses to be pinned down. And people ask me, do you think Jordan Peterson's a Christian? I said, no. I mean, if a guy refuses to be pinned down, that's not a Christian. A Christian is not going to refuse to be pinned down. They're going to shout it from the rooftops, right? Which is okay. He's in a process. Now, he's very taken with Lewis's journey, C.S. Lewis's journey, which seems like on a similar track to his, which took a while, but he's... I know that I've seen clips where he's talking about Jesus, and he gets very emotional about it. And this concept of Lewis's, that actually came from Tolkien, I think, or one of the other inklings, that what you're talking about with Jesus is the true myth. It's not just a kind of a Jungian archetype, but something that actually took place. And when he starts grappling with that, and it sounds persuasive, that brings him hardcore into history and out of the Jungian stratosphere, so to speak. You think?
Yeah. Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I there's one particular conversation he had with someone who's quite often a sort of theological dialogue partner of his, Jonathan Pajot, who's an Eastern Orthodox thinker. And this was, I think, probably influenced by the fact that Peterson had only recently come out of quite a sort of life or death situation. He had a very terrible illness for some time where he was really, on the edge of life or death. And not long after he was sort of coming out of that in recovery, he had this conversation where he got very emotional, as he often does. And I think that's part of the attraction actually for people, that he really does wear his soul on his sleeve in that way. He talked about how confounded he was by the person of Jesus, and how he found in the person of Jesus the literal, if you like, historical world of material facts and history met the psychological world of myth and meaning that obviously Peterson is so invested in, and somehow in Jesus both those worlds collide, is the way he put it. And he said, I believe, yet I hardly understand my belief, I think was the way he put it. So I think he's definitely on, as you say, a very C.S. Lewis-like journey. It was exactly that kind of same kind of path that Lewis took with, in that famous walk he had with Tolkien around the grounds of Magdalen College, where finally the pieces fell into place, where he realized that he didn't have to sacrifice the world of meaning and imagination that he was so invested in, and the mythologies of the dying and rising gods, which he thought Christianity was just another instantiation of. Because actually, what if myth became fact in the person of Jesus? What if that one person, all of that mythology, imagination, and meaning suddenly took physical, historical, real, objective form? And for I think, I very much get the sense that Peterson's going on a similar kind of journey to Lewis in that respect.
Well, at this point, I'm quite frustrated because I've got about 2 hours more with questions and conversation for you, and we're really running out of time.
I can come back on and we'll do a part 2.
Well, I mentioned that there are 4 stages that you identify in your book, if I read it properly: the decline of atheistic secularism, and a new foundation. Actually, we didn't even get into this. A new foundation, except for you made a reference to Tom Holland, but being laid by, especially with historical works, people like Tom Holland and Rodney Stark. And then a rediscovery of the Bible. You spent a lot of time talking about that, which is, to some, I think our listeners are going to think, that's just amazing. You mean these radical, like atheist types or secularists are kind of rediscovering the Bible and beginning to take it seriously? And I think some of that has to do with the way the biblical story fits the world, and also, as we've been talking about now, provides grounding for the things that they intuitively understand are deeply valuable and meaningful to human existence. And then this other element, discoveries in science, and you spend a lot of time talking about that too, that have the force of driving these people to reality. What reality is telling us is that there is a design and a purpose. I was going to get into, ask you a little bit about the we had like 2.5 minutes or 3 minutes to go here, but about determinism and Daniel Dennett and all the craziness there, which you cover so well. I mean, Daniel Dennett holds that consciousness is an illusion, and you talk about the hard problem of consciousness and what other people around Dennett are seeing in the foolishness of this point. So let me just jump right to the last part of the book here in the last 2 minutes or so, Justin. And you talk about one piece of advice you give to prepare. You give 3 pieces, but one that really struck me was to prepare for this great new awakening for Christians, to keep in mind that people are coming around that you never thought would come around, is to keep Christianity weird. Keep Christianity weird. Do you remember that part? It's towards the end.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, what I was noticing was, as I was interviewing and speaking to a number of these secular folk who were just kind of considering Christianity again, the Jordan Petersons, the Tom Hollands, the Douglas Murrays, I realized that a lot of them, they didn't want a kind of watered down, kind of warmed over humanism version of Christianity. They didn't want a church that was sort of looked so much like the culture it was barely distinguishable from it. They frequently, what they told me was, if I'm going to come on board, Justin, give me something that's different, that's kind of different to just the secular material story of reality.
Right.
And what the phrase that one of them used was, keep Christianity weird. And I think one of the problems was that some of them were seeing some of the mainline churches simply adopting all the same kind of leftist ideologies and kind of those sorts of stories, and they were completely put off by that. Others sort of saw certain types of mega churches kind of just adopting a very kind of materialistic sort of popular pop culture kind of ways of doing church, which they left them kind of cold. I can get the Coldplay concert much better than the church can deliver it, and they wanted the mystery, the meaning, the depth, the kind of the ancient aspect really of what this was. They wanted to be connected to something much deeper and richer. So I think that's a lesson that we need to listen to. I think the church needs to take that on board, that sometimes people aren't looking for something so contemporary that it feels actually irrelevant to them. They're looking for something rather different, and that's worth bearing in mind.
Well, I'm so glad you kind of end on that note, and we did as well here. There's one citation where the gentleman says something like, the Christians, compromising in this regard, wanted to be more like me instead of asking me to be more like them. And I think of the temptation a lot of times to try to sanitize God, even with some of the more demanding and challenging things that people see in Scripture. And your point of keeping keeping things weird is really encouragement not to sanitize God. Justin, gosh, there's the music. Goodness gracious. It's been so much fun talking with you here today. And I hope it's not another 5 years or so until we connect again. Justin Brierley, author of The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. It's a fantastic book. It's masterfully and intelligently written, and it deserves a slow reading, which I will give it. All right? Greg Kokel here for Stand to Reason. Give them heaven, friends. Bye-bye now.